Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're continuing our series. This is part number 2 of a 4-part series where we go through all 16 Myers-Briggs personality types and we talk about what they look like when they look healthy. Oftentimes when you see things written or talked about around personality type, people sometimes tend to focus on the negative aspects, the parts that are unhealthy or show up that need to be fixed in a personality. But what do personality types look like when they're done well, when they are healthy and showing up in a healthy way?
Yeah. Well, and what you'll also see, I think, when you read content around each of these types is not just, yes, we do oftentimes see how they show up in unhealthy ways, or at least maybe that's more the banter of like Myers-Briggs groups when there's some type patriotism coming out and the conversations between members will be like, well, your type just does this and this and this. And they're like, no, your type is the one that sucks. I think that's oftentimes where we see the negative aspects of type come up. But even in type descriptions, what I've noticed is that, and we do this to some extent too, is we want to encourage people to understand the positive components of their type. And so the descriptions get a little stereotypical with, and maybe even a little glowing about each of these types and what they're supposed to be really good at and what careers they're supposed to choose. And one thing that we've noticed is that when a person is showing up healthy, and of course, if they're showing up healthy, that means more than just showing up healthy as that personality type. When they show up healthy, there are certain trends that you can see come out in each of the types that may not match the stereotypes. They may not be a cliche of what that personality type is, but it's still manifesting in a healthy way. And in fact, when a person is really healthy, sometimes they defy their type. Sometimes they have qualities or skills or talents that show up that aren't quote unquote stereotypical, but they are still healthy for their type. So what we wanted to do is talk about what each of these types look like at their healthiest, while at the same time acknowledging and maybe even removing some of the stereotypes.
Yeah. Now, if you listened to our podcast last week, we talked about the EJ types, ENTJ, ESTJ, ENFJ, and ESFJ. So we talked about all the EJ types, and we talked about what they look like when they're healthy. This week, we're going to talk about the EP types, ENFP, ENTP, ESFP, and ESTP. If you have never heard about what we use here as a framework for looking at personality, which is called the CAR model, one thing that will really help you in listening to this conversation today is to go over to our website, personalityhacker.com, and type in the search field there, CAR model. Articles and information will come up around this. It's a great framework to look at personality type because we talk about something that's technically called cognitive functions, which is basically how your mind is wired, how it's learning information, how it's making decisions. And that 4-letter code that Myers-Briggs, your Myers-Briggs personality type gives you is basically like, we like to call it a decoder ring for how your mind is wired, how you're learning information, how you're making decisions. So that's a great framework for you to look at, to understand some of the nuance of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, we'll be relying a lot on cognitive functions, or at least we'll be at minimum peppering the conversation with them in order to understand how the types show up healthy. So if you're unfamiliar with cognitive functions, then there's some great resources. Type cognitive functions into a Google search, and if you want the easiest way of understanding it, or what we think is one of the easiest ways of understanding it, if you're unfamiliar, then go to personalityhacker.com and type in CAR model into the search engine. So one of the things we've noticed that is a theme with all EP types is that when an EP type is not healthy, let's just use unhealthy versions right now as a contrast or as a foil to the healthy versions. When an EP is not healthy, one thing that is very obvious is how unsafe they make the people around them feel.
Yeah.
Because EPs are some of the most spontaneous. They are some of the biggest rule breakers. They are people who are willing to take major risks, just as sort of a natural character makeup. And not to say that when they're healthy, they stop taking risks, or if they're healthy, that they stop doing things spontaneously. But it's not so much what their behaviors are, it's how they're making the people around them feel. And an EP that has reached a very high level of health, one of the ways that you can see this manifest is that even though they're still spontaneous, or even though they still may be risk takers or rule breakers, they're not going to make the people around them feel fundamentally unsafe in their presence. So we'll go into a more, specific style of health for each of the 4 types, but that's one theme we see run through all 4 EP types. When they're at high levels of health, the people around them don't kind of get that nervous, twitchy feel, not knowing what the EP is going to do. They could do literally anything, and it could be a bad, scary thing. People just kind of rest in their presence. They calm down. The EP makes them feel good as opposed to anxious.
So full disclosure, Antonia and I are both EPs. Antonia is an ENTP and I am an ENFP. So today's conversation is near and dear to our hearts because this is a little bit about us that you're going to hear today.
Yeah. And we probably unconsciously carry some bias, but that's okay.
I'm sure we do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess in full disclosure and radical honesty, we're always carrying biases at all times. That said, we've tried to use more than just our experience to determine health by actually looking towards our mentors, looking to people or toward people that we look up to determine like what is the goal, what's the end game, and where do we want to end up. So we want to first tackle the 2 personality types of the 2 ESP personality types, ESTPs and ESFPs. Both of these types share the same dominant cognitive function, or what we call the driver process, of extroverted sensing, or our nickname for that is sensation. So they're going to share certain characteristics when both of these types will share characteristics at the greatest levels of health, but they will still show up differently. However, we want to take them as sort of we want to look at the shared characteristics, but then we also want to take them separately to really showcase how they show up as unique individual types.
Yeah. So the stereotype about ESPs, ESTPs, ESFPs is going to be a lot of language around athletes and musicians and sports professionals, people who live in the moment, live for the here and now. And there's some truth to these stereotypes. Oftentimes, the reason that is the case is both types, ESTP and ESFP, lead with what's technically called a cognitive function called extroverted sensing. We've nicknamed it sensation. Sensation's a very present and in the moment perceiving function or learning function, a way to take in information, take in the world around us. And when someone has this as their driver process, they are very interested in what's happening sensationally, what's happening to their senses, what's happening in their world, what's happening in the external world. What is the smell happening, the taste happening, the sight happening, what's going on right now in the present moment. So this process oftentimes lends itself to people who are very much in their body. They're in their body kinesthetically, maybe seeing their body as extension like a machine, like a machinery, piece of machinery. Maybe an ESTP would see that more that way. Or extension of energy or movement or how they feel about something. ESFPs are more probably going to feel this way. Now, again, those are more stereotypical descriptions of how these 2 types show up. But what is the non-stereotyped version? What is the way that these 2 types show up in a healthy way? Oftentimes, we, again, look at this adrenaline rush part of the sensation process. But I've known ESFPs who, for example, who aren't into the adrenaline rush aspect of this. They're more into the performance end of this. So I know an ESFP who's an actor. I've worked with him before, helping him with some marketing and teaching other people how to become actors. He's an ESFP, and he channels all of this primary sensation process of being present, being in the moment, being reactionary to what's going on around him into his acting and modeling work, into his performance work. So you could see that this extroverted sensing process can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. It doesn't just have to be in like athletics or in the moment bungee jumping or crazy sports. In fact, this guy doesn't do anything extreme like that. He doesn't go and do bungee jumping or boxing or anything that's you would typically associate stereotypically with an ESP. He does things like acting and modeling.
Yeah, and one thing I've noticed is that, and why don't we just go ahead and take ESFPs first, since
Absolutely.
You already mentioned your friend. And by the way, I mean, this guy, you probably have seen him as an actor. If you watch shows like House of Cards, or if you've ever seen The Wire, he plays smaller parts in those shows, and he does a great job. He's a commercial model, and he's been in thousands of ads across the country. One of the reasons why he's so good at what he does is because he uses his body as an instrument. He's very good at getting like specific facial expressions. He's really good at being able to get feedback from his directors very quickly and is very responsive to what they need him to be doing in the moment. And so he's extremely successful at what he does. Now, one thing I have noticed about him on top of that is that he's not frenetic. He has a very steady energy. Now, he's been in the arts for a long time, and he started out as a musician. He went from being a musician to being a commercial model, and from there he went into acting. Or was it acting first and then commercial model?
I don't remember the order, but something. It kind of all happened
Right.
at the same time.
Well, regardless of what order it happened in, you can tell that he's done a lot of work to develop that co-pilot process of introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. And that really plays out in more than just his performance. You've done work with him. In fact, you were his marketing manager for a while, and that's how we know him, is because you did a lot of work with him through, advertising and promotion and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that one thing that was a little frustrating for you is that when you were writing copy, and now copy is meant to push buttons.
Yeah.
Copy,
it's meant to be persuasive.
That's right. The point of copy is to push as many emotional buttons as possible. And you were actually pretty good at that, Joel. You're really good in copy pushing emotional buttons, and that's the point of copy.
Yeah.
However, every time you would write copy, like really good button pushing, emotional button pushing copy, he would go through and he would want to neuter it because it didn't feel in integrity for him. It didn't feel in alignment for him. It felt like it was exploitative. Now, obviously, copy is to some extent somewhat exploitative. So that's sort of the world of copy and marketing and that sort of thing. So we're not really talking about the world of copy. But we are talking about this ESFP showing up in a way that very much wanted to make sure that everything he did was in alignment with his values. He wanted to make sure that he was showing up in an honest way. He wanted to be in integrity with himself. And that's really interesting, considering that a lot of people who have as their 10-year-old position the process of extroverted thinking or effectiveness, they can get very exploitative. And we'll talk a little bit about this with ENFPs as well. They can get to a point where they see a very quick trip to the end, or like a shortcut, basically. If they see shortcuts or ways to make things happen very quickly, they don't oftentimes think in terms of sustainability. They don't oftentimes think in terms of like, how is this going to come back to haunt me? But he had done so much work in his co-pilot process that he almost didn't even have to think about whether or not it was sustainable, because he wasn't thinking in exploitative terms at all. He was thinking in terms of inner alignment and showing up in a way that had that alignment and integrity. And this was in part because, as a dominant process of extroverted sensing or sensation, he had trained himself to be very sensitive to the feedback of the world. He's very sensitive to how people are perceiving him, and he wanted to make sure that how the world was perceiving him was lining up with his inner values. And so now his 10-year-old wasn't hijacking him at all. There was no hijacking of the 10-year-old. There was no what is called the SETE loop, or the dominant tertiary loop. We call it going to your 10-year-old process of that defensive process. There was none of that showing up for him because he didn't even have to think about it. His 10-year-old wasn't thrust into a position of having to control decisions and then therefore making undeveloped, immature decisions. The front two passengers, the adult in the cars, were very much in control. And so the 10-year-old got to show up in a way of simply holding space. That extroverted thinking process got to show up as just being very steady, as being very, and he was very effective. He is very effective. He's very successful at what he does because he makes sure to keep that alignment piece reflected in the outside world.
Yeah, I think the principle to take away here for an ESFP, if you're an ESFP or you have one in your life, my friend, when I would present a marketing idea or I'd write copy, often he would say, let me think about this for a little bit. Let me sleep on this and get back to you tomorrow. I'd write some aggressive copy, maybe put some scarcity in there, some things to push people's buttons to try to get them to buy one of his workshops or seminars. And he'd come back and he would sometimes neuter it, but sometimes he'd just alter it a little bit just to reflect the true way he felt about it. Because obviously I'm writing copy on his behalf. It's supposed to be coming from him with his voice. So he needed to make sure it felt like it was congruent with how he felt internally. And he would often take time to let it percolate, let it sit in that authenticity process, which is his growth state, and really think about how he felt about it before he'd let me send the email out or put the copy on the website, which I thought was great. I resonated with slowing down and not just going, okay, yeah, it looks great, and go for it. Take the time. So I think a healthy ESFP, when you're showing up as a healthy ESFP, you're showing up by taking the time to not react, but to respond, to spend the time to be responsive and get into that introverted feeling, that authenticity process to really feel how you resonate with something. Now, obviously, the bigger the decision, the more time you're going to want to take. Smaller decisions, you can probably, where to eat today, you can probably have a pretty good sense of that as an ESFP in a healthy way and make quick decisions. But again, the bigger the decision, you have to let that process work its magic, that authenticity process. How do you really feel about this decision? And I think that to me is one of the best narratives for a healthy ESFP and how they show up.
Yeah, that steady energy. And I've noticed, we talked about in the last podcast, the EJ types. A lot of times the recommendation or the way that they show up healthy was slowing down as well for them. And I think that's a trend in all 8 of the extrovert types. Healthy extroverts generally show up by having a steady energy that is built on slowing down. Because extroverts have a tendency to want to, get a lot of stuff done. They want to be gregarious and, get things accomplished in the outside world. And we get a lot of feedback, as extroverts, we get a lot of feedback that that's the direction we should be going. Get a lot of stuff done. Be type A. Make it happen. Make it work. Make it go fast, fast, fast. Beat the clock. There's a lot of reinforcement we get for that behavior. When really that's not our growth path at all. Our growth path is slowing down, being more responsive, as like you mentioned, Joel, as opposed to being reactionary. And for EJs, they do that by getting into their learning process, which is their co-pilot, right? Either perspectives or memory, what we call perspectives or memory, where it's technically called introverted intuition or introverted sensing. For all the EP types, this is getting into their decision-making process of introverted feeling or introverted thinking, what we call authenticity or accuracy. And so slowing down and being very deliberate and making sure that things resonate with you internally is the growth path for all EPs. And so, our friend Aaron is an ESFP who's an actor and a model and a musician, all very stereotypical careers for an ESFP. But it doesn't matter what job you're in. It doesn't matter what career path you've chosen as an ESFP. It doesn't really matter what direction you're headed in really any of those decisions. You will show up looking healthy if you've got that steadiness about you. You've got that ability to slow down and make sure things are resonating with you internally. So all the stereotypes around ESFPs as being like gregarious and the life of the party and like comedians or performers or, athletes or whatever, all of that can change or, follow the stereotype or whatever. That's not the important thing. The important thing is, do you have that energy that is steady and puts others at ease? Doesn't feel frenetic, doesn't feel like you could do anything at any moment, doesn't feel like you're unsafe, but rather feels like you're a container that you're not going to just jump into action. I mean, you can jump into action, but not be cavalier about your decisions. And that is really the sign of a healthy ESFP.
Action rooted from groundedness. Let's contrast the ESFP with ESTP. So whereas the ESFP is using that authenticity co-pilot to make their best decisions, that's their growth state, and they need to slow down and get into that authenticity piece, an ESTP is using a process technically called introverted thinking. We've nicknamed it accuracy. That's their co-pilot, and that's their growth state. That's where they need to be making their best decisions from, using that cognitive function. Now, accuracy, introverted thinking, shorthand TI, is used for understanding data and how data interplays with other pieces of data. So accuracy is really good at understanding frameworks and basically how information works with itself. Now, it's a little bit divorced from people. Now, it takes people into account when it's managing and manipulating and deciding about data, but it's not wanting to take the human experience in as much as it wants to know the actual quote-unquote truth of a situation. It wants to know what is the actual piece of data here. What's the truth I'm working with? Not what people say it is, but what's the actual truth?
Yeah, and the more unhealthy an ESTP is, the more there are in some way fleeing from that truth. And the more healthy they are, the more they're embracing it. So an unhealthy ESTP oftentimes shows up as somebody who is dealing with some cognitive dissonance. And the easiest way to deal with cognitive dissonance is to not let the world around you, and remember, the world around you is constantly reflecting back, as a mirror of truth. And if you're leading with extroverted sensing or sensation, you are very in touch with those messages, right? Like you are always seeing very like subtle messages come at you at all times, because that's what sensation does, is it's just really in touch with the world around it. And so if you've got some truth you're fleeing from, but the world around you is constantly giving you messaging around that truth, then the best way to deal with that is to just simply dominate the conversation at all times. And my observation has been that the more unhealthy an ESTP is, the more they are in constant output. It is very difficult for them to listen to anybody else. They are taking over all the conversations, they're dominating conversations, they're just in a steady stream of output. Conversely, the more healthy an ESTP is, the more they're listening, the more they're able to input, because there's really no danger in what you have to say. They are just like an ESFP at their highest levels is in integrity with themselves, in alignment with themselves, and so therefore, has the ability to show up in that aligned way. An ESTP doesn't fear any form of truth that will come at them because they don't experience the discomfort of cognitive dissonance. They have embraced truth. They've embraced hard truths, difficult truths, truths that maybe they don't want to have to see about themselves, but they're okay with it. And there's really nothing that, there's nothing that you're going to trigger inside of them. So they get really calm. Again, right? They get more calm. They get more responsive as opposed to reactionary. They are a lot better at sharing the floor with other people. They don't have to be in a constant know-it-all position. They don't have to constantly be schooling others. And they don't have to be messing with others as much. One of the stereotypes around ESTPs is that they can be kind of harsh. There's an invasiveness to ESTPs when they're not healthy. Now, that doesn't mean that they're constantly invading. It just means that when you're in their presence, you don't really feel like it's a back and forth relationship. And another piece that comes up with unhealthy ESTPs is this push-pull relationship they have with their 10-year-old of extroverted feeling. When you are, and I say this as an ENTP, so this is not exactly the same, but there's a lot of behaviors that show up similarly because we share the same co-pilot and 10-year-old processes. There's a sense that the only acceptable emotion to show to others is a powerful emotion, or one that feels like it's a powerful emotion. Whether or not it is up for debate. And that powerful emotion is anger. So there is a sense that if there's things not going the ESTP's way, there is a tendency to go to a bullying position of anger. Now, in healthy ESTPs, there's a relationship with the co-pilot process of introverted thinking or accuracy, which is fundamentally, you mentioned the data management piece and information, just really being able to understand, things as being either congruent with themselves or consistent with themselves. But one of the easiest ways to describe it is just to say it's concerned with what makes sense. Now, emotions don't make sense for the most part. That's not their job. Their job is to not make sense. However, our relationship with our emotions, you can conceptualize, you can analyze that. You can make that more of a logical choice. And anger is not a logical choice, really. It doesn't make sense to constantly be in an angry position. Anger is divisive. It creates schisms. It doesn't feel good. It's a toxin inside of you. It is poisonous. Even though it feels like a powerful emotion in the moment, when you've just blown up at a bunch of people and looked erratic and, like you're crazy, that's a very disempowered, feeling retrospectively. You're like, oh, I kind of was a dick back there. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And so the more an ESTP grows and develops, the more they recognize that the anger is not a healthy expression. It's acceptable. It's okay if you feel angry, but it's not a place to live. It's not a go-to tool. It's not a way to bully others into what you want. And so there's a morphing that happens. It's not emotional Aikido like we talk about, in times past with introverted feeling or authenticity. It's more of an honest assessment that encourages you to build other skills other than anger. And one of the ways I've noticed that ESTPs, all ETPs really, when they remove the anger component, is they replace the vacuum with feelings of compassion or just trying to be sympathetic of other people, trying to give them some space. One person who I don't think they're the example of a like they're not a finished example. I'll just say that. None of us are really, all of us are works in progress. But one of my favorite examples of an ESTP is Bill Burr, the comedian Bill Burr. Now, you may not like his stand-up. He's got a lot of un-PC things to say. But I love his honesty. I love his ability to sort of rat himself out. And he rats himself out in his stand-up all the time by talking about like these stupid fights he'll have with his now wife, or it was girlfriend at the time. And he'll talk about how, he'll get in the car and like, honk the horn and like scream epithets and punch the ceiling, of the car or the roof of the car. I guess cars don't really have ceilings and they have roofs. But he kind of rats himself out about this, and you can tell that he's saying it in like, this is not acceptable behavior. Like, this is kind of stupid that I'm doing this. And so it's an honest assessment of like, these behaviors are not okay. And so again, it's a matter of like slowing things down. And you and I have a friend who's an ESTP. He's now in his 70s. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think early 70s, late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah. And he's like, every time I think of a healthy ESTP, I think of this guy. He was a firefighter. Again, a very stereotypical ESTP job. And not that you have to be a fighter or first, or an early responder position, even though that's very stereotypical for ESTPs. But he just has this not slow, but slower than a lot of EPs' energy. He's very thoughtful. He has no problem with a back and forth conversation. He takes in all of your input. He misses no details. And he'll just ask you what is going on when he sees something that strikes his curiosity. He has a very steady energy. He feels very honest. And he feels like a person who holds a lot of space for others. Like, he has compassion for others. He doesn't make assumptions about other people's idiocy. And again, it's that energy that just makes you feel safe. He feels very protector oriented. And I think a lot of ESTPs that are healthy feel more like protectors than they do like people who will hurt you if that's something they need in order to, get out of a situation that might reflect a truth that they're avoiding.
Yeah, I think that FE, or that extroverted feeling, we've nicknamed it harmony, 10-year-old for ESTPs, it lets them be enough in touch with how people are going to respond to them. And when they want to use that co-pilot of introverted thinking, accuracy, to speak truth, they have enough read on it that a lot of people, that rubs them the wrong way. We live in a world where actual radical honesty is not very welcome by most people. Most people like having their codependent relationships or their little lies they tell themselves. So when you show up as an ESTP and you begin to speak truth, you learn very quickly in your life, oh, it's not okay for me to speak truth. So you start to go to that 10-year-old process of harmony. And here, like you said, anger can come there. And what I look at that is, for an ESTP, when there's anger, it's basically a synthetic way they're trying to speak truth. They're trying to get how they really think about a situation truthfully out. And they feel like, okay, it's a safe container for me to explode maybe in this way, or come out angrily here or there. When if they can give themselves permission, I think the narrative for a healthy ESTP is to give yourself permission to speak radical, honest truth, not couched with any kind of, pejorative nature, just the truth as it is. I think you will see you're showing up in a very healthy way because you've given yourself permission. You don't need that anger as a crutch or the strong emotion as a crutch to try to bring the truth out. You're just doing it naturally. So I think getting into the accuracy process and speaking truth for what it is, for an ESTP, it's going to come off very slowed down, very centered, and very caretaking, because now that process that you were using for anger can now be utilized for harmony, for caring for the people around you and creating a safe space for those people.
Yeah, I've noticed that the healthier the ESTP, the more hospitable they are.
Yeah.
There's a sense of hospitality and caretaking that comes from a settled 10-year-old. Again, the healthier the person is, the less anxiety that 10-year-old process has, because, just like any kid, when you're 10 years old and your parents drop the ball, there is major anxiety that comes up, because on some level, your inner wisdom, even though you're only 10, is going, dude, they're the adults in the situation and they can't even handle it. So all of a sudden I have to handle it. I'm only 10. I don't know what's going on. And that same dynamic plays out in the different cognitive function stacks in our car model. When the co-pilot adult process isn't showing up, that gives the 10-year-old a lot of more responsibility than they should have to deal with. And so they get anxious and they don't know what to do. And of course, they're going to go to things like trying to force a situation or stomp their feet or, whatever ways that it looks. But when a person is at their healthiest, that 10-year-old process knows that, quote unquote, mom and dad have it handled, or the parents, the parental units, the adults in the car are doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not dropping the ball. And so the 10-year-old gets to come out in a far more intimate way. It gets to come out as its beautiful, like fun 10-year-old, sweet, charming, playful self. And for ESTPs, regardless of what career they've chosen. My dad's an ESTP. He went into marketing, but he was a chemistry major. I know plenty of ESTPs that are teachers, like high school teachers, or, there's a lot of different professions an ESTP can go into. But when they are at their healthiest, they show up in a very hospitable way. They show up in a way where they're not afraid of truth. They have a very healthy relationship with honesty and truth. That's their playground as opposed to something to be avoided. And they just have this great energy about them. They feel like they could really handle any situation. And so people rest into that. And again, as opposed to fearing what could happen, what that person could do, maybe feeling a little unsafe around them, they have other people, they just create this emotion of you can lean into them, you can rely on them. They're a person who isn't going to create a bad situation around you, but rather they're a person who can just get it done.
Let's switch gears and talk about the ENFP personality. Now, very much like the ESFP, the ENFP is going to use the same co-pilot process of authenticity. Now, the technical name is introverted feeling, but the driver process is different for ENFPs. And what an ENFP uses as their driver process is a cognitive function. This is how they perceive and learn information, a cognitive function called extroverted intuition. Technical name, extrovert intuition. We've nicknamed it exploration. Now, exploration is all about finding patterns in the outside world, finding things that are related in the outside world, messing with things and finding out the pattern behind the pattern behind the pattern by messing with the environment. So exploration is very interested in what if questions. What if we could build a colony on the moon? What if I started speaking a foreign language on the first day of class when I show up to all the people that speak English? And what are they going to do? Are they going to look at me funny? What if I, in the middle of a Barnes and Noble, just lay down on my back in the middle of an aisle? What are people going to do around me? These are the kind of questions that extroverted intuition asks in the middle of life and going through life.
Yeah, and with the exception of colonizing other planets, the last two examples are totally things you've done, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You're pulling from your actual experience.
And resource is the only thing stopping me from colonizing other planets.
Right. Well, and what's great about exploration is that it's a very optimistic process. Like you said, it asks what if. And so what if questions are very, that's very possibilities oriented. And so ENFPs lead with this concept or this character trait of possibilities and optimism and anything can happen. It's a very much an anything can happen place.
Yeah, well, obviously, as somebody that uses authenticity, so the ESFP was very interested in what's happening in the here and now, because an ENFP is using the exploration process and that possibility thinking combined with an emotional decision-making process of introverted feeling. It can see possibilities in people. It can see how someone's heart basically is showing up, their character traits. And it can see that in the moment, but remember, it can see abstract thought and future pacing and connections and behind the curtain things that aren't necessarily there. So it will project positivity onto other people often. And when it's healthy and doing itself in a healthy expression, an ENFP will look at someone and go, you have so much potential. I can already see it in you. And the person's like, what are you talking about? I don't see that in myself. Yeah, but basically they're using their exploration process and they're saying, yeah, but I see so much that you can do and be and become. And they're very inspirational. I think an ENFP at their best, when a narrative for an ENFP, when they're at their healthiest, at their best, becomes an inspiration to other people. They help people see in themselves things they can't even see about themselves that are positive and good.
And then looking at that 10-year-old process of extroverted thinking or effectiveness,
yeah,
there's a sense that, like, now that I've seen you at your best, or now that I know what the positive, or possibilities are, now let's equip you with tools to be able to make that happen. And that's in contrast with the unhealthy version that skips the co-pilot process of introverted feeling or authenticity, and then goes straight to the 10-year-old of effectiveness, which, as we already mentioned with ESFPs, can be very exploitative. It could see the shortcuts. It can see like, okay, well, I want to get something done, and here's the fastest way to make that happen. And it might end up not being a sustainable thing, but I'm not going to look at things like sustainability. I'm just going to get it to happen, or make it happen. And that can, trample all over other people, especially if you're not, really focused in on that introverted feeling or authenticity process, which allows you to feel sympathy for other people and really understand their human experience. And so an ENFP that doesn't look healthy tends to be very exploitative, but they maintain that feeling of charm or charisma or possibilities thinking. And so it ends up looking a little con man-ish. But I think that the more developed the ENFP looks, the less exploitation is on the table for them. The more they'll make sure that every action they take is in alignment with themselves. Again, very similar to the ESFP. And so that means slowing everything down. It means sleeping on it, like we mentioned with the ESFP. Whenever there's a major decision to be made, you don't make it quickly. You don't make it so that you just make, something happens or you just get it done. You slow it down and you make sure that that decision is in alignment with who you are and your identity and how you want to present to the world. So the more the ENFP is healthy, regardless of what direction they've gone. Again, a lot of stereotypes around motivational speaking or, like all these different styles of career. And you even mentioned that an ENFP at the top of their game helps other people see the possibilities in them. And that can look a lot of different career choices, a lot of different frames, a lot of different relationships with people. But removing the stereotype of what they should be doing career-wise, just looking at the manifestations of health is that the ENFP is going to be somebody who's very inspirational to others and doesn't make them feel unsafe. There's not a freneticism to them. There's not a sense of dicking with somebody or playing with them or messing with them in a way that makes others feel uncomfortable. There's a sense that they're going to be a container, that they're going to be a safe place for others to really feel positive and good and optimistic.
There's a scene from a movie where I believe the main character is an ENFP, and he's basically using his co-star. I mean, it's part of the plot of the movie, right? He's using the co-star as a prop to be funny with other people. And she pulls him to the side and she says, "That's the last time you ever get to use me as a prop. I'm not a prop for your comedy. I'm not a prop for you to help make a funny joke. I'm a person. I need to be respected as a person." And it's a wake-up call for this character in the movie going, that's right. It is a person. I can't just use them like I'd use a product or a service. Like this is a real life entity here that has feelings and a heart. And I think an ENFP, when they're not healthy, can often utilize people almost like props for their own performance nature or their own, joking nature or whatever they're trying to accomplish. But I think a healthy ENFP realizes that people are not just resources to be pulled off a shelf and to be used. They're people who, if you want motivation from them, if you're leading and trying to accomplish something, it's through inspiration. It's through pulling, not pushing. It's not using, it's inspiring. And I think that's really where healthy ENFPs show up. It's the vision I would cast for you if you're an ENFP or you have an ENFP in your life. That's the framework. That's the way to look at it, is that these are people, not just resources. Let's talk about the ENTP personality type in the Myers-Briggs system. Our fourth one we're going to talk about today shares the same driver process as ENFPs, that exploration process. Very similar. It's out in the world pushing buttons, trying to find out the patterns, asking the what-if questions. But different from the ENFP, ENTPs use that co-pilot of accuracy, introverted thinking. Again, that's about data, about what makes sense, about what is truth, and the data and the digital data points behind something, basically, to make decisions based on those what-if questions. So it's a little different than that authenticity process. Accuracy is much more interested in concrete judgments about what is truth and what is truthful for the person that is the ENTP.
So with ENTPs, when they are at their healthiest and their best, they're using the combination of that driver process of extroverted intuition or exploration, that possibilities thinking, that what if thinking, the ability to see patterns that maybe other people miss, the ability to understand the relationship between disparate disparate ideas or concepts or things, which is a characteristic of extroverted intuition. When they're combining that with introverted thinking, which is about data management and truth and seeing congruencies and consistencies or incongruities and inconsistencies, my observation has been that they, at the top of their game, are just profound problem solvers. They are really good at finding solutions to problems, and that's when they feel the most lit up. If you put an ENTP in a situation where they basically have a puzzle to solve, whatever that is, it can, my observation has been that they gamify almost everything. And I say they as if I'm not an ENTP, but I also identify with this. If you can give an ENTP a puzzle to solve, you just delight them. They'll be at it all day long. But if there's a sense of removal from that co-pilot process of introverted thinking, just like with the ESTP, if there is a truth they're trying to avoid, or if there is something that they don't really feel like they're ready to accept yet, then they won't develop a healthy relationship with introverted thinking, and they'll separate themselves from it in a lot of different ways, including the problem-solving way. They won't feel like that's a terrain that they really want to enter, because when you enter the space of any cognitive function, you're entering the entire domain. And each function does multiple things. For introverted thinking, it does multiple things. It holds data, it understands information. And the only way to do that is by being willing to look at data in a clean, pure, unemotional, no emotional attachment way. When you get to that space of looking at information without any emotional attachment, that means if you run into something that is a truth, is a digital data point that you don't particularly like, and that is something that does, has an emotional trigger for you or makes you feel really bad, then unless you have made peace with and developed that co-pilot process, you're going to flee, right? Like you're going to get out of there because there be dragons. So the healthier an ENTP is, the more they've gone ahead and just looked at those dragons full on. They just look at those data pieces that they might not want to see, and they form a healthy relationship with that information, just like the ESTP had to do. There's not a separation of radical honesty. There's not a separation of trying to figure out what reality is. There's nothing they're fleeing from. And so ESTPs, we just talked about this with ESTPs, they have a tendency to just want to output like crazy, and they don't want the world to reflect back to them any truth they're trying to avoid. And ENTPs do this as well, but as opposed to maybe more of a storytelling component that ESTPs go to, ENTPs have a tendency to go into a know-it-all teacher mode. They have a tendency to be the ultimate authority on everything. And their output is them trying to fix everybody else's problems, or them thinking that they're the final arbiter of all information. And there's a lot of one-upmanship that ends up happening. There's a lot of competitive nature. I think this is why there's this stereotype around ENTPs really messing with people. And also the stereotype around ENTPs basically always getting in these arguments of one-upmanship. But the healthiest ENTPs, they might enjoy debate, and debate might be a sharpening of the sword or a sharpening of the saw for introverted thinking. But debate isn't going to be something that they use as a way to avoid reality. They're going to use debate as a way to sharpen or hone their skills, not as a way to dominate over others and therefore marginalize the opinions of others and not have to listen to them when they're reflecting a truth that the ENTP is trying to avoid. And just like ESTPs, the more healthy they get, the less they're going to sink to that 10-year-old process of extroverted feeling or harmony as an expression of anger, because they have the same, they share with like ESTPs, they share that co-pilot and 10-year-old relationship of introverted thinking and extroverted feeling. So that same behavior, that same tendency to backslide to anger is going to show up in ENTPs just like it does for ESTPs. But again, the healthier they are, the more that anger turns into more of a compassionate stance. It's more of a desire to connect with other people. ESTPs do it through caretaking, I've noticed, and ENTPs do it through relationship building. They can also be caretakers to some extent, but I think ENTPs more do it with a camaraderie and more of a sense of wanting to build something community-oriented, wanting to be a helpful or valuable member of a bigger group or context. And so ENTPs, instead of being know-it-alls and having to dominate in every argument and conversation and having to one-up, instead they become sources of coaching. They become sources of being helpful, showing up when somebody needs them, and maybe leading a charge of something that, maybe infrastructurally needs some attending, showing, pointing out incongruities and inconsistencies in the world. One of my favorite examples of this right now is John Oliver. John Oliver, who I suspect is an ENTP, is somebody who uses his talent for spotting incongruities and inconsistencies to every Sunday point out something in the world that we know of, in the institutions that we all buy into, things that are toxic. And he uses comedy to do that. He uses being funny and he uses being charming. And I wouldn't say it's like a charm that an ENFP possesses. It's kind of different, but it's more of like a, hey, we all kind of know this, right? Isn't it funny that this is happening? How absurd is that? How do we all as a group or as a community or collective maybe do something about this? And I think the healthier the ENTP is, the more that's the track they're going to go down, and that's how they're going to show up.
Yeah, I think to contrast the ENTP with the ESTP, we talked about anger with that harmony process, that extroverted feeling as a 10-year-old for ESTPs. I think for an ENTP, the anger is expressed not so overtly. You don't see ENTPs, you can see them exploding and being angry, but I think often it comes out in the form of sarcasm or biting, critical commenting. Like, I could see John Oliver, for example, being very sarcastic, but he's done a lot of work. Instead of being sarcastic, he's basically calling out absurdities. So a healthy expression of an ENTP is someone who can call out the absurd, call out the truth of the situation without layering it with that underpinning of that anger or sarcasm or passive aggression. I think that's really the healthiest version, is they're calling out absurdity, but not to make fun of somebody and not to be sarcastic, but it's definitely to enable people to see a truth they may not be willing to see. And I think that's the difference here, the nuance. So whereas ENFPs are inspirational, I think ENTPs are enlightening. They enlighten people to the absurdities of this truth that we all kind of know. Like, well, we all know this, right? And we laugh about it. But it's not so biting as that sarcastic, unhealthy expression.
And again, an ENTP, all the EP types, you could see how all of them could show up in a way that would be disconcerting or unsettling for others.
Sure.
And an ENTP, at their healthiest, just like all the other EPs, will have slowed down their thinking process. They're going to be truly thoughtful. They're not just going to have like a quick, like, what makes sense to me and go. And, well, that's stupid, right? Like, you can tell immature, introverted thinking because the first line of response for an immature, introverted thinking is, that's stupid. Like, it's the easiest way to deal with something as a TP, and I say this from personal experience, is to just completely disregard it and go, that's idiotic. And I probably use that phrase a lot more than I like, because I'll just look at somebody and go, why are you so stupid? Why are you such an idiot? And that's probably the laziest way to use the introverted thinking process. The healthiest, least lazy, the most sophisticated way is to figure out how that makes sense to the other person. Everybody's doing the best that they know how to with the tools that they have. And everybody is doing things that make sense to them. So instead of just dismissing something and going, well, that doesn't make sense to me, so that's dumb and stupid, figuring out how that can make sense to an individual. What are all the different components, or what are the nodes in the system that the person has to have set up for them in order to have their conclusions make sense? Because they do to that person. So the more sophisticated an ENTP is, the more, instead of being dismissive and just lumping people in a category of idiots or stupid, the more they are truly trying to get inside the minds of other people and figure out how they reach these conclusions. And in that way, just like with the ENFP, we mentioned how they were they were inspirational, saw the positives in others, positive things, were very optimistic. And that was a combination of exploration, authenticity. And then they used the 10-year-old process of effectiveness to now give those people tools, or to now, have a tool to enable this positivity and this optimistic and, possibilities thinking. For an ENTP, once you've been able to break down other people's thought processes on a more nuanced level and really understanding how things make sense to them, now you can call upon your extroverted feeling or harmony 10-year-old to add a layer of compassion. and connectedness, really trying to connect with another person and meet them on the level of that makes sense to them, and then using harmony to persuade that person in a more connective, relationship oriented style to maybe think about alternative forms of logic or analysis. If you hit people over the head with a club, all you're going to do is knock them out. You can't beat somebody. You can't beat somebody smart. You can only beat them dumb. So the more you are bludgeoning others with truth, the less they're really going to be able to handle that truth. But as ENTPs really emerge at their healthiest, they're not bludgeoning other people with truth. They are using compassion to help other people understand truths that are hard to swallow. And so then, like you said, they do become enlightening because the recipients of that information aren't trying to bat them off. They're not trying to disregard it. They've learned, I guess one way of saying this is, as an ENTP, you learn how to convince yourself of truths and not run away from them. Because that's the first thing you have to do, is you have to be radically honest with yourself. And so you have to build skill within yourself of being able to accept these difficult truths. And so once you build skill within yourself of accepting these difficult truths, now you can take that skill and apply it to your relationships with other people and help them accept difficult truths. And I think in that way, ENTP show up for what I would argue is their entire purpose in the social ecosystem. And just like ENFPs show up very inspirational. That's the way that they show up in the ecosystem. And ESTPs show up as people who are really great at handling situations and are extremely good at figuring out how the world works around them, whether that be a firefighter or a mechanic or a chemistry teacher or a marketer. They show up by helping figure out solutions to everyday problems. And ESFPs show up as performers and as, people who are just really kind of down to earth. They figure out human problems. They figure out the human condition and then help reflect it back to us in a way that we can really manage and understand it. So all of these different types have a place in the social ecosystem. And when they show up at their healthiest, you can really see how we need each of these types, how we can't really survive without them. We need the services that they render. And when they're really healthy, we rest into it. That's why we feel safe around them, because we recognize that we as an ecosystem can't really live without them.
Yeah, we talked about the ENTP, ENFP, ESTP, and ESFP types, all 4 of the EP types. This is basically part 2 of a 4-part series talking about the healthy expression of all 16 of the Myers-Briggs personality types. We're finishing up the extroverts. And I think just a note about the extrovert, we talked about this throughout this podcast, the last podcast, slow down. If you're an extrovert, one of the biggest things that you can do is really get into that co-pilot process, which is going to be introverted for you. That process is going to be introverted. It's going to take time. There's going to be some missteps. As an extrovert, you're used to moving through the world quickly. You're used to engaging with the outer world. And it can take some discipline and some attention to slow down enough to get into that co-pilot process to show up in some of the ways that we've cast as healthy expressions of your type.
And I already mentioned this earlier, but I want to reiterate this to all extroverts because I think it's a really important point. You will have to ignore feedback from the world that encourages you to not slow down.
Yeah.
The world is going to reward your extroversion. We're living in a very extroverted time period in history. And so all of the fast, the movement that we go, just this blinding speed through life, and all the things that we can get done and all the things that we can accomplish and all the socializing that is, has a major, we have all this expectation on us to be socializers and to be out there and putting ourselves out there and go, go, go. You will have to ignore all the reinforcement you get that is the behavior you should be continuing to do. You're going to have to take time for yourself that goes contrary to some of the messaging you get, that it's wrong to slow down, that you're supposed to be going at these lightning speeds, that you're supposed to be in constant socializing, networking mode. You're going to have to ignore those messages, and you're going to have to take that time for yourself. When I use the phrase take it, I mean, you're going to have to take it. Nobody's going to give it to you. So make sure that you take that time for yourself to go to that introverted space.
We've just scratched the surface. Obviously, there's way more. We could talk about on all these personality types. So we invite you to come over to personalityhacker.com. We've got tons of articles, resources, recordings, videos, audios, more podcasts around each personality type. In fact, we've got them organized on the site now where you can find your type and read a bunch of information and do a lot of research around your individual personality type. And if it makes sense for you, we invite you to invest in the premium starter kit program around your personality type. There's a lot of great information, great advice in that starter kit as well. So personalityhacker.com is the place to come over, and also leave a comment about what you think is a healthy expression of your type underneath this podcast. If you are one of the types we talked about today, what are some ways that you've struggled showing up in a healthy way? What are some ways that you've actually shown up in a healthy way? I want to hear your stories, your personal stories, and get a conversation going around this, around the healthy expression of your personality type. We also invite you to come over to facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, where you can engage and join in with a community of like-minded people just like yourself who are interested in not just understanding their own personality for its own sake, but using that understanding to grow ourselves in personal development.
If you like what you hear, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you are feeling a sense of reciprocity or just giving, please feel free to leave a rating and review for us on iTunes. It helps us out a lot. It helps them, it puts us higher in the charts. They cross-promote us on other people's podcasts. So it's a gift you can give to us by leaving a rating and review.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.